Reality is going to start tearing apart in a couple of months. This might be your last New Year's Eve. I swear, of all the times I could have gone back to, this couldn't have possibly been any worse. Everything is FUBAR. Those jerks in the lab couldn't even send me back enough to have a decent time before things go straight to hell. Wonder if I can find them and give them a piece of my damn mind right now. No, that would just be a waste of time. Right now, I need to find him. God knows what could happen when I don't come back immediately. They'll probably send someone back here after me. No way am I going back there, though. Not if I can help it. Forgive any kind of typos or anything I might have here. I'm not really used to this era of tech, and text-to-speech is a pain in any decade you land in. Hell, even 20 years from now it's no better. Not that the technology gets much better thanks to everything going to crap. Wish I could enjoy the first taste of freedom I've had in years. Been locked up for years, not of my own volition, mind you. I was just a kid when things started to go to hell. Grew up only knowing chaos and isolation. If we're being totally honest, I don't know a whole lot about how things went down in the early days. But maybe what I do remember can help avoid what's going to happen, assuming anyone takes me seriously. I don't know what year they sent me back from. Lost all track of time, to be honest. I do know that it's currently New Year's Eve 2024 where I'm typing this. That means you have about 2 months before they start popping up. They'll come slow at first. You'll hear about strange, isolated events, horror movie scenarios in a lot of cases, pretty high death counts that will make no damn sense to anyone based in reality. That's the problem, though, is that we've only seen our reality. The assholes that sent me back here, the collective, they're supposed to be keeping a lid on these things. The veil tears, and they show up to stitch it back up. Things slip through when it tears, though, and it's those things that start to grow out of control around March. First, it was isolated, various areas of the world. There were reports of a cruise ship coming back with everyone on board slaughtered, torn apart, and chewed on by something that was never found. Over in Italy, a small countryside town went up in flames overnight, talk of the dead rising up to attack the living. By the middle of 2025, there was a new tier popping up every week or so in the United States. Rhode Island was one of the first states to fall under martial law. Borders got closed down by the government, military sent in to make sure nobody goes in or out. I ended up in a holding cell with a survivor who was there when things began, and it sounds like something out of a sci-fi horror. One day in mid-June, he said a visible tear opened up in the sky, like a theater curtain ripping right down the middle. This giant thing climbed right out. According to him, it looked human enough, though it looked pretty rough, like the flesh was rotting right off the bone. Eyes were sunken in, hollow pits that just surveyed the land around it, looking for something unknown. Well, not long after that, everyone found out what it was after food. This thing landed down right in the middle of Providence, tall as a 3-story building, and started picking up anyone stupid enough to be nearby. It was reaching through windows, grabbing people out and just devouring them. He said it reminded him of this cartoon from before the tears. Giants that would just eat humans endlessly without their hunger ever being satisfied. The bad thing was, this son of a bitch had no way of dying. Military did a flyby within a couple hours of it appearing, lit the fucker up with enough bombs to take down a small nation, and this thing just started walking off, covered in flame but totally unbothered. Providence was ashes by the end of the day, and that damn thing is still off wandering the countryside somewhere. Hell, it's probably crossed state lines by this point. Considering the military fell for good in 2026, I can't give a good rundown of everything that happened across the country since I was still a kid at the time. Think I was 10 when my little town finally got a tear in the sky far above us. God, I can't forget that day no matter how hard I try to. The year was 2027. The United States had fallen and divided itself into various city-states and no-go zones based on the tears that had been appearing. To our east was the Georgia coastline, turned red by a tear that opened somewhere underwater off Tybee Island. All the sea life died within days, the smell of rotting fish reaching inland for weeks on end. By the time it faded away, we had become used to it. Meanwhile, off to the northwest, there was a tear that had covered the entire area from Macon onward in a thick darkness. If you went close enough, you could see where it starts. Just a thick veil of darkness engulfing everything all the way up to Atlanta with no idea how far on it stretched. Saw some survivors from there getting carted through a collective facility a couple years back, just empty shells of people. One of them was raving about these centipede creatures and a king of nightmares, but there was never any confirmation we could get from them through all their madness. It was such a clear day when Tear happened. The way the sun was shining, you would think nothing bad could have happened that day. Scary stuff only happens in the dark. That was what I was raised to believe, at least. We were in one of the designated stable areas that the collective watched over. According to them, our area had a steady grip on reality that kept the tears from appearing. Bastards. Maybe it wasn't much compared to what we all had before, but the little commune that was set up to survive was everything I ever needed. We had friends and neighbors, all of us doing what we could to help each other survive in the terror we were living through. Dad grew crops. Our neighbor Dale was a doctor. Mom taught a little preschool for all the kids, making sure they knew to read or write. Even in the midst of unfolding hell, we were making it, surviving. I was out helping Dad and some of the other neighbors in the garden. We were trying to pick what we could before the sun scorched the crops, leaving them useless to eat. The meager supply of tomatoes, peppers, and sweet onions wouldn't be much, but the little potato patch we had was booming so far that year, promising some nice consistency in our diets. I know all of us kids were drooling watching the small patch where we had thrown watermelon seeds down, seeing them bloom into fruits larger than our heads. Ricky, one of the other kids around my age, almost got all of us in trouble by convincing us one was ready and we should just take it off the vine. Idiot wouldn't listen to any of us that told him it wasn't ripe yet, cracking it open himself and seeing almost all white and pale green inside instead of the juicy red. We only didn't get in trouble because of how fast everything went downhill in the next hour or so. We all looked up when the shadow passed over the field, blocking out the sun we had just been desperately sweating under. There hadn't been a cloud in the sky, nothing to give us even slight shade from the heat, yet everything started to look like nighttime within seconds, right during the middle of the day. Everyone looked to the sky, met with the same terrifying sight. A tear was opening above us, right in front of the sun, high above, blocking it from view. Wherever it was high enough to cast a shadow over the land as far as the eye could see, and the wildlife of crickets and frogs that had been screaming just moments before finally started to go quiet. There was no sound, just the whisper of a slight breeze, chilling me to the bone in the formerly sun-soaked June heat. Through the tear, I could see. I'm going to sound fucking insane here, but I swear there was an audience. There were thousands of them, maybe millions, all watching through like the tear ripping our sky in half was a movie screen. Then the threads began to fall. Millions of them, razor-thin threads that could barely be seen in the darkness that now engulfed us. The audience through the tear applauded, rising in fervor as these threads descended on us, falling with the force of a damned plane barreling toward the ground. Ricky was one of the first to be hit. The thread managed to fall right onto his head, hitting him with so much force it cracked open worse than the watermelon still sitting beside him. The way all the blood spattered on it, you would almost think it ripened up in seconds. The other kids all ran screaming, but I could just fall on the ground, staring in terror at what was happening. All around me, more people were getting hit by the strings, impaled with enough force to punch holes through them. "Robin!" My name was the last thing I heard my dad say. He was looking around for me desperately, trying to get me into safety. Meanwhile, strings were hitting the small houses and shelters set up a little ways off, bursting right through the rooftop and doing untold damage to our meager life. I could hear screams coming up from that direction too, no doubt by those that were on the receiving end of the threads. I turned over, desperately trying to crawl on my belly toward anything that I thought might give me shelter, and saw Dad running toward me, still screaming, "Robin, run!" His runs weren't natural, jerky movements that almost made it look like he was floating above the ground, never quite touching down. If it wasn't for the blood soaking them, I probably wouldn't have noticed the threads that were holding him up, making him move around like some fucked up marionette. He was still alive, though there was something causing a bloom of blood on his chest that was making him struggle to breathe. I watched as he was yanked around, those same exaggerated movements pulling him toward me from above. Someone, one of the other neighbors who was still alive, ran by him, desperate to get to safety somewhere. Dad, totally against his will and screaming in agony, was flung right at him, threads breaking his arms to force him to grab onto the man. As soon as he did, some of the loose threads pierced right through the neighbor, picking him up to be a hellish puppet. The entire time the audience above is roaring with laughter and delight, applause ringing out like thunder as they saw the carnage unfold. Maybe they thought I was dead. Maybe they were just saving me for later, but the puppets paid no mind to me. At this point, there were probably 5 or 6 of them hanging around the garden area we had set up, some being made to walk around in exaggerated swagger, others forced into doing a stupid dance, and 2 that had gone off to their own little corner, whoever was puppeteering for them making them slap each other comically like an old cartoon bit. I was just laying there, tears pouring down my cheeks as I prayed they couldn't find me, watching the audience above get plenty of laughs from the show unfolding all around me. Before long, the meat puppets started to wander off, searching out any that were still hiding in homes nearby. Nobody was safe, it seemed. Women, children. I saw in the distance one of the small kids, probably 3 years old, being made to walk around, hanging just above the ground as the threads manipulated his small limbs. I can still hear his cries when it gets too quiet, guttural, begging for his mother to help him. But she was strung up right alongside the poor kid, unable to do anything. Eventually, I came to my senses, feeling hunger well up in my stomach that made it growl loud. It had been hours, maybe a whole day. I honestly don't know. The sun was still invisible behind the giant audience above, still stuck to their seats watching as unseen masters pulled the strings on my former friends around me. At one point, I ended up eating a raw, sweet onion straight out of the ground, wincing a little as dirt nestled in my teeth. But my stomach was grateful nevertheless. Looking back, there's no way a 10-year-old kid should have gotten out of that alive. Much less been the only survivor, but I made it. Crawled my way over to one of the tool sheds that was unlocked, still awaiting the gardening equipment that we had taken out what felt like just minutes ago, back before our lives were destroyed. The sound of sobs was inescapable, with all those strung up still somehow alive despite their grievous injuries. The audience above was still watching intently. Nowhere else to be, I guess. Through the tear, I could see that their eyes were totally black, teeth visible in wide grins that never seemed to leave. Occasionally, the puppets would dance or do something that brought a little cheer, keeping the audience hooked. Finally, agonizingly, I got into the tool shed and picked up a rusty hatchet that was in there. I was running off pure survival instinct now, thinking that I could cut down any strings that got in my way while I army crawled myself out of town. There wasn't any logic behind it, just the need to escape. For the sake of keeping my own body intact, I stuck to the ditches and wooded areas where I could. There were still strings hanging down everywhere, nearly invisible to the naked eye, but the trees helped to block them and ensure I had a little more mobility. I clutched that hatchet so tight I thought there would be a small handprint in it by the time I got to the outskirts of town, just hoping that there would be some way out of here. Of course, it wasn't going to be easy. The audience above wasn't done using me for entertainment, apparently. I emerged from wooded area after pulling myself through a small creek, desperately hoping I was finally at the end of my journey, only for my mother and father to suddenly fall from the sky above, seemingly flung over on their threads to meet me as I clawed for freedom. All I remember is their blank expressions, staring at me without recognizing. Their minds had been broken from the pain, limbs twisted and broken from forced movement, and the audience above wanted them to be the ones to capture me. All I remember is swinging the hatchet in desperation as they were flung at me, managing to catch a few of the threads holding them up. Both fell to the ground, mangled, as more threads began to fall towards us to try and pick them back up. Before they could get their hands on my parents again, I used the dull hatchet to deliver multiple hits to their necks, putting them out of their pain. Then I kept moving, this time running on 2 legs as the threads chased me down. Someone found me passed out near Highway 40, still gripping that hatchet, face down in a ditch. Next thing I know, I was loaded up in a truck and driven to a nearby collective facility, put into a small holding room where 2 suited agents asked me millions of questions about what happened. That was years ago now. I've been back and forth forever, at first in a collective-run foster home for survivors of tears. If you thought the foster system in the good times was bad, let me tell you this was a whole other issue. Plenty of assholes left to reap abuse on those of us with no other alternative. That's how I eventually ended up in a collective prison colony after beating a foster father to death. Not that I was the only one who took part in killing him. The others still had a possibility at living, though, so I took the fall. Through the prison system, I've met plenty of others with stories equally gruesome. We all end up here one way or another, just trying to survive most of the time. But the collective is merciless in collecting prisoners to keep their own small efforts to maintain a society moving. Then about 3 weeks ago, I got taken by one of the guards to a special program. They found a tier that was different from the others. One that, with the right measure of electricity channeled through it, apparently let them send people back to unspecified times. They told us that if we go back through the tier, we would be granted our freedom, but had to find collective agents in the time we went back to and warn them of what's to come. Most of us practically jumped at the chance because, hell, we had never seen what a normal world looked like. I don't know what time period the others ended up in, but scouring the internet in the day since I've been back hasn't afforded any kind of information about if they made it or even how to find the damned collective. Before everything went to hell, they were a shadow organization. Least they could have done in the future was give us some kind of distress call or something to find them. Doesn't matter. I'm pulling up now. I can see her through the window, smiling as she talks. He's in there too, reading a newspaper, unaware that the happy little life he's cultivated is about to come crashing down around them. They don't know that hell is coming to Earth. I'm going to make sure they never do. Do you know how easy it is to buy a gun in 2024? I was able to walk right into a pawn shop and pick one up with the old money they gave me before sending me through. Not even $100, and I was the owner of a fancy little revolver. I didn't need to go all out or anything, just one box of ammo enough to load the revolver with. Wouldn't even need every bullet that was in the cylinder. Just one for Mom, one for Dad, and 2 for me. Look, if anyone from the collective ends up reading this, I've done my fucking job. I warned you, you should know what's going to happen from here. If you're able to stop it is a whole different situation, but that's not my problem anymore. Whether the tears happen in this timeline or not, I'm going to make sure I never have to deal with it. Considering the time, you might be better off following suit instead of ringing in the new year. I genuinely don't know if my writing this will make any difference, but it pains me to see the world in such a panic, and no government can or is willing to offer a satisfactory explanation. I don't know if my clarification of current events will satisfy the panicked urges of the masses and satiate them into some sort of melancholic acceptance, or multiply the fear response and cause chaos the world over. I am also writing this for the historical record. In the very unlikely event a historical record continues in any way past the next 2 or 3 years. 2 years ago, scientists noticed the moon seemed to become dimmer in the night sky, reflecting less sunlight. It didn't take long for observers to see that there seemed to be dark patches forming that weren't there years before. The familiar craters and shadows of the surface were becoming blemished by dark spots that reflected very little light. Over the next few months, the dark patches were observed getting slowly but consistently larger, and soon entirely new dark spots began to form. Many theories were proposed, including that there was water beneath the moon's surface that was somehow being drawn out. While the public really latched onto that, it didn't take astronomers long to debunk that theory. Water would be far more reflective than whatever the dark stains were. It was incredible how quickly a new manned mission to the moon was conceived, engineered, and executed. It took just over a year from the first observation to send the new Saturn VI rocket to deploy 4 astronauts to the moon. By this time, the majority of the moon's surface was nearly dark, leaving every night looking like it was a new moon. In just a matter of days, the astronauts returned with samples of the dark material from the surface. The dark material was not a powder, like the familiar gray dust the surface normally consisted of. It was solid, and had a similar consistency to obsidian, though obsidian is very shiny, and this material seemed to absorb more light than it reflected. The astronauts had to chip pieces off with tools to get samples to bring back. All the public knows at this point is that Florida is quarantined. The American government never said the real reason why, publicly. They blamed a new pandemic but wouldn't share information with any other world governments. What disease could be so contagious and so profoundly deadly that detonating a nuclear weapon at Merritt Island seemed to be the best option? Epidemiologists the world over demanded samples of the pathogen, but it never came, and it didn't explain why it seemed to originate from a black glassy material on the moon. The unfortunate truth is that it is not a disease, whether terrestrial or extraterrestrial in nature. Most people, I imagine, may be relieved to hear it isn't a disease, but it's far worse. The material, which physicists at CERN theorize could be strange matter, appears to propagate indefinitely. Anything touched by even an atom of the material converts to the material. It didn't take long after the astronauts landed to see that their suits and tools were quickly becoming black glass. The fascination quickly turned to worry when the quarantined astronauts displayed parts of their bodies being converted to the glass. Medical procedures were immediately conducted, surgically removing the glass. It wasn't growing on or in them, but instead, that part of their body was turned into the glass, replaced entirely. It was quickly discerned that the only way to prevent the glass from spreading was a full amputation of the converted body part at a point well away from the glass. However, this turned out not to matter, as blood cells that had made contact with the glass spread it to other parts of the victims' bodies, and the conversion continued. The patients were painlessly euthanized when the hopelessness of the situation was realized. It didn't take long for the surgical instruments to be observed converting. No matter how well washed or sterilized they were, they became glass. Whatever surface they were laid on became glass. The surgeon's hands began to turn to glass. It was obvious by this point that anything at all that had contact with the glass would turn into it. Everyone was immediately isolated and an unprecedented quarantine was set in motion. We begged the president not to authorize a nuclear strike, as it would only accelerate the conversion, but he caved to public pressure. Their mistake of identifying the issue as a disease led to the perception that a thermonuclear explosion could burn up the virus. This scattered vaporized particles of the black glass into the air, scattering it God only knows where, and planting microscopic seeds for the glass to begin spreading from. We first thought we had up to a decade before the planet was entirely converted, possibly giving us enough time to figure out how to leave. Now, the nuclear strike sent the suspected strange matter into our atmosphere, landing anywhere, colliding with molecules of air and water vapor, which will collide with more molecules, and every molecule touched converts to strange matter. Because the spread is exponential, the scattering of particles has likely accelerated the spread, and we believe we have at most 3 years. I doubt we can engineer and execute a mass evacuation to a new space colony in 3 years, when we never even landed on Mars. I don't see much hope. If this is the strange matter that the physicists believe it is, a particle the size of an atom could have collided with dark side of the moon decades ago, and we didn't notice the spread until recently. We should have left it up there, or not let the astronauts re-enter the atmosphere. Some people said we should have shot down the shuttle before it landed, but you can't destroy matter with a missile, not at the atomic level. It would have scattered the black glass anyway. At least this way we have a few years to hold our loved ones and wait. I've seen the classified photos of houses, animals, plants, even people, all converted into black glass perfectly in the shape of what it used to be. It's a bizarre phenomenon to witness. It's almost beautiful, like a piece of artwork carved by the most skilled sculptor in the world. It isn't actually destroying anything, simply converting it. It's all still there, but gone all the same. Maybe the particle of black glass was launched out of a neutron star when it collided with another, hundreds of millions of years ago, and sealed our fate before we even evolved as a species. We can never know, just theorize. But at this point, the origin doesn't really matter. We have at most 3 years. 3 years before we are all statues on the surface of a dead planet. I'm so sorry to tell you like this, but personally I'd rather know the futility and live my last years on this planet to the fullest. At least, to try. Something is seriously wrong with the train station in my town. The modest name betrayed its true nature, though, and did little to warn you of the gargantuan size of the thing. Dozens of trains coming and going at all hours of the day, both above ground and below it, and hundreds of market stalls and shops littering the property. Everyone in town knew about it, knew the rules and the nature of it. When I was young, I recall heading there with my mother to peruse the shops, and I remember being absolutely stunned at the size of it all. The items and services being offered were staggeringly diverse and oftentimes downright confusing. As we made our way through, I noticed how many signs there were. Maps posted everywhere, and the same yellow warning sign on every corner. Return to the designated overnight shelter, or vacate the property before sundown. It read, a stark warning that I was too young to comprehend at the time. It's been years since that day now, and I hadn't visited the station since my mother passed. Another childhood memory fallen by the wayside as work, an ailing love life, and other adult responsibilities consumed my time. It was only last week that I decided to take a trip down memory lane and go check it out again. I had lost my job, and I needed something to waste time on. I figured reliving simpler times was as good a time waster as anything, certainly better than blowing all my money at the bar. So I hopped in my car and made my way there. 20 minutes later, I was walking through the entrance gates. The first thing that struck me when I arrived was something I had completely missed when I was a kid. The layout and architecture of the entire place was all screwed up, confusing. Just looking at the little paper map I got at the entrance, I could see that this place was built like a maze for whatever reason. Like the people who designed it were just scribbling random shit down. The strange nature of it all was driven home when I took in the actual scenery for myself. The architecture and layout of every building was absolutely bizarre, unconventional. It felt like a fever dream. I shook it off, though. People come here every day, right? I would be fine. With my doubts safely tucked away in the back of my mind, I spent the day browsing the shops. I bought a few things and talked to a few people. It was pleasant overall, and eventually I decided to make my way down into the subway portion of the station. I'd never seen it before, and wanted to take a look before I headed home. That was my first mistake. The subway had a completely different atmosphere than the station. The chatter of crowds and the cool evening breeze were replaced by the buzzing of fluorescent lights, stale air, and an endless maze of identical gray walls. It was suffocating, and I found myself uncomfortable very quickly after I'd left the stairs. About 5 minutes later, I'd found myself at boarding station, and sighed in relief. The open space and groups of people did wonders to ease my anxiety. It even had a concession stand. I wasted no time getting in line to get myself a snack and a bottle of water, my stomach growling. As I waited for my turn in line, I heard the rumble of a train. Moments later, it was pulling into the station, wheels screeching as it came to a halt. It was the first time I'd actually gotten a good look at one of the trains here, and I wasn't all that interested until I got a proper look in the windows. Strange, alien-looking people were sat on the train. Men with insect heads. A large hairy man who I was almost sure was Bigfoot. Reptilian creatures perched atop the seats. Every passenger looked like it clawed its way out of a 90s B-movie or a sci-fi novel. It was utterly bizarre, and I was gobsmacked by the sight. I was still processing all of this when the person in line behind me cleared his throat. Right, I was next in line. I stepped up and bought a few things, kind of mumbling, entirely on autopilot as I tried to make sense of everything I'd just seen. With food in hand, I made my way to a bench and sat down. I ran through explanations in my head and managed to convince myself that it was just me being paranoid, my imagination running wild. Surely those were just costumes, I managed to convince myself. I sat there for a while after that, just wrestling with my thoughts as the lights buzzed overhead. It was about 30 minutes later that I noticed a new sensation. I was being watched. I looked up and around and realized that every single person remaining in the station was staring straight at me. The crowd and I stared at each other for what felt like ages, and I began to notice things about them I hadn't before. Their faces and bodies were just wrong. Facial features distorted or missing, limbs bending and twisting at odd angles. Completely wrong, but subtle enough that I had failed to notice in my distracted state. Eventually, one of them pointed at the yellow warning sign on the wall, still staring at me wordlessly. I began to panic and fumbled for my phone to check the time. 9 o'clock. Shit. I instantly leapt from my seat and began to make my way back towards the stairs. The last thing I needed was to get arrested for trespassing after dark. Isn't that funny? All this creepy shit, and the only thing I was worried about was getting arrested or fined. Guess my brain just hadn't caught up with everything that was going on yet. As I hurried my way towards the exit, I realized two things. One was that the space I was in felt even more suffocating than before. The tunnels felt smaller, the lights brighter. It felt like the station itself was displeased with my being there. The second was that I had forgotten my map. My slight panic erupted into a full-blown freakout then. The thought of going back to get it was unnerving. All those strange people were still there. But going on without it was an equally terrible idea. A rock and a hard place. Eventually, I made up my mind and turned around to go retrieve it. Before I could take a step, though, I froze. There was someone else in the tunnel, a man I recognized from the boarding station. Seconds ticked by as we stared at each other, neither one making a peep. Eventually, the silence was broken as the man spoke. "Did you see the sign?" he said, completely monotone. Yeah, I was about to leave, but I forgot my map. I hadn't realized how late it was," I replied, failing to mask my unease. He continued to stare for a moment before speaking again. "Did you see the sign?" He repeated in the same tone as last time. Yeah, man, I saw the sign," I replied once more. The man took a step forward then, causing me to take one back. "Did you see the sign?" Same phrase, same monotone delivery. What the fuck was this guy's problem? "Yes, I saw the fucking sign. I just need to get my map so I can get out of here," I snapped, equal parts frustrated and freaked out by his weird behavior. He simply stared at me, completely unfazed by my response. Then he took a quick step forward, then another, and before I knew it, he broke into a dead sprint towards me. I swore and bolted in the opposite direction. Everything after that was a blur. Drab gray walls streaking by, overhead lamps blaring as I ran wildly through the subway tunnels. The entire time we were in chase, the man simply repeated that same phrase from before. "Did you see the sign?" I take a left. "Did you see the sign?" A right, then another right, then a left. "Did you see the sign?" I take another right. The only thing in my world at that moment was the sound of my panting, the thunder of footsteps echoing through the tunnel, and that goddamn phrase being repeated over and over again. Eventually, the man's voice got quieter, more distant. I didn't stop running, though. Not until I'd stopped hearing him entirely. Once I was sure that I was alone, I collapsed against a wall, panting heavily in both exhaustion and relief. My lungs were on fire and my legs felt like jelly, but I was safe for now. Time passed slowly as I recovered, slumped against the wall with my heart beating out of my chest. Finally, I'd calmed down enough to take stock of my situation. The realization of how fucked I was now nearly sent me into another panic attack, though. I was lost now, with no map, and on top of that, my phone was dangerously low on battery with no service. The only things I had on me were a bottle of water and half a bag of Skittles. I got to my feet, weighing my options before deciding on the only real course of action. I began to walk aimlessly through the tunnels, praying to find an exit. I spotted a cult on my hike. I think I've made an enemy out of them. I'd finally hiked to the top of the cliff I wanted to. The warm summer heat made the trek a bit more difficult, but it was all worth it. To commemorate a milestone of pursuing photography as a hobby, I wanted to take a picture of the sunrise at a national park about an hour's drive from my city. I was going to camp out overnight, building a shelter out of branches, mud, and rocks. I had a bit of time to kill, so I took in some of the scenery. The valley below was a grassland with nothing but rocks and shrubs. It was pleasantly silent. There was something that caught my eye down in the valley, however. It looked like a pile of rubble from afar, but it was difficult to make out the details from afar. The cliff I was on was at least 70 feet high. I decided I'd take a picture. I took my camera and zoomed in on the pile. To my surprise, it was actually a strange layout of polished and carved rocks. Most of them were perfect blocks with a long slab in the middle that looked the size of a banquet table. I snapped the photo, thinking maybe someone online would know the history behind it. I began working on my shelter. I was savvy enough to bring rope, a handsaw, a settler's wrench, and a small shovel to dig up clay with. I was disturbed by nothing and got myself settled into a shelter of primarily clay walls. It was snug in there. I could roll over and stretch, but just barely. I'd drilled holes into the shelter to let some fresh air in. They doubled as peek holes, too. After 3 hours, I'd built a trapdoor that I could access from inside and outside the shelter. It probably looked like an anthill from the outside. I was completely concealed. I gave myself a pat on the back by gorging on all my snacks. I was pretty stuffed by the end, and even got a few pictures of the setting sun to go with the sunrise photos that I initially wanted. I forgot to charge my phone. It was sitting at a good 30%. It would hopefully last me if I was responsible. I shut myself in my shelter not long after the sun went down and passed out. I was awoken by noise coming from the valley. It was a mix of cheering and shouting. Odd thing to have so late at night or early in the morning. I opened up the trapdoor so I could crawl out and investigate. I got a good view of the commotion from where I was positioned atop the cliff. The sun wasn't even rising yet. No. Instead, the glow came from little bouts of fire floating down in the valley below. Torches, I was certain of it. The torches moved around the strange block formation that I had eyed on my way to my camp not all that long ago. I could barely make out figures carrying the torches. I could see silhouettes below the lights. An idea popped into my brain. My camera could zoom in. I had already snagged a good photo of the formation before. I crawled back towards my shelter and opened up the hidden door. For a brief moment, I was cozy. Couldn't I just ignore the weird shit happening down below me? No, I was far too curious. I got my camera out of my bag and cleaned the lens as quick as I could. The grass atop the cliff was long enough that I was partially concealed to most. I crawled to the edge of the cliff once more, camera in hand. I was fortunate enough to have a nighttime shooting mode as a preset. I did my due diligence to shut off any sort of lighting as to not give myself away. I peeked into my camera and began zooming in. The torches were being held by men in robes. I quietly chuckled. Was this some sort of secret role-playing party? I'd heard of similar things in Burning Man, but I didn't see any drugs or LED lights anywhere. Still, it was pretty unsettling, and I carefully kept my eyes on them. They turned over some of the stones to reveal braziers that they lit. All the while, they were still chanting something I couldn't understand. I did a quick count, 9 of them. The group went into a formation surrounding the largest slab dead center of the block formation. With all the braziers lit, one of the robed members blew a horn that made the sound of what I could best describe as a screeching sheep. It was a sickly sound that echoed beyond the valley. If I didn't know any better, I'd say the thing was screaming in my face. Then nothing. Silence, with the odd breeze swaying the grass I was in. The robed figures stared deeper, completely silent, into the valley where nothing showed until 5 minutes later. More torches illuminated in the distance on my left. However, I could very well hear something distinct and horrific. A woman screaming her lungs out. She sounded like she was in agonizing pain. I zoomed in the best I could, and found that she was being carried by 4 more robed figures. They had one for each arm and leg, restraining her thrashing effortlessly. I watched helplessly as they carried her to the slab. It dawned on me that this was no weird role play in the valley. This was a cult that performed rituals, no less. The woman was begging to be let go as they put her on the large slab. They chained her to it, and that's when I noticed she'd already been hurt. I couldn't tell from the distance whether it was a burn or a carving, but an inflamed, horned sigil was marked on her stomach quite crudely. I needed to do something. I looked back at my shelter and realized how hidden I was. I could help, then retreat to the shelter and hope for the best. If I were to cause a distraction, maybe the woman could escape. The chains that bound her to the rock didn't seem that tight. She could probably wriggle out if she tried hard enough. The chanting started up again, louder than before. It drowned out the woman's screams. I decided to swiftly and subtly act. I threw a rock off the cliff. I could hear the echoes of the rock hitting the bottom, and a few of the cultists took notice. They stared at the base of the cliff before resuming their work. They splashed a dark liquid on the woman, coating her stomach completely. I think the poor girl was in shock, for she barely reacted to it. I could see her movements were slowing down. One of the robed figures turned around and picked up a crudely made stone hammer. He brought it above her head and she stopped screaming. Instead, she just wept, defeated. I had to do something. The rock wasn't going to be enough. I sighed, engaging the flash on my camera. I took the photo. The flash lit up the valley like a comet had graced the sky above us. I quickly ducked down as the chanting and all subsided. I reluctantly peeked through the camera again. All the cultists were staring from where the flash came from me. Then they started screaming, charging towards the base of the cliff. I scrambled back into my shelter, sealing the trapdoor shut. They were going to have to go a long way around to get to where I was, and that gave me a perfect chance to try calling for help on my phone. I could still hear the screaming, and it began sounding more feral and inhuman. I shuffled around my bag for my phone. 14%. I had to risk it. As I began dialing, hoping my signal would reach, I felt something shaking. I could hear the screaming get louder, as well as rocks falling from down the cliff. A knot in my stomach formed as I realized what I was listening to. I didn't think it possible, but they were scaling the cliff face. They were climbing fast too. I couldn't afford to make much noise. I stuffed my phone in my pocket and prayed that I wouldn't be detected. I inspected the roof of my shelter. If someone stomped hard enough, they'd probably cave it in, and I'd be discovered and mutilated. Through the peek hole I drilled earlier, I saw the first of the cultists reach the top of the cliff. He was wheezing, but he was persistent. He simply ran deeper into the forest, right past me. More of them came, and soon it was like a stampede was galloping past me. I didn't even risk looking through the hole anymore. I simply held my breath, pepper spray in hand. I could hear them trampling through the brush in front of me, but there was one straggler who had just finished the climb up the cliff. He did a rallying screech and charged right towards my shelter. His boot stomped down on my shelter, missing my face by inches. The shelter's ceiling had caved in, but the monster didn't seem to care, charging onwards. I began hyperventilating, paranoid more would come, or worse, that they'd come back. Thankfully, they never did, but I could still hear them for a good 10 minutes afterwards, charging towards nothing. I took out my camera and crawled out of the shelter towards the edge of the cliff. Risky, I know. I zoomed in to see if the woman was there. She was gone. It appeared she'd freed herself from the chains and made a run for it. I panned around the valley, and eventually I spotted her running back the way she was carried in from. It was the closest to a highway, so I'd hoped she'd find salvation from this nightmare. I stayed still until the sun began to rise, and I got the picture that I wanted of the rising sun. Only this time it wouldn't bring a good memory, but a memory of a nightmare. A memory of people that had evil inside them, functioning on the outskirts of town. I made it out of there, and I'm home safe now. I hope that poor woman is too. Nobody knows about the rock formation yet, what's affiliated with it. I hope to have answers soon.